right, this is our lecture discussion of the peripheral nervous system. This is continuing on with the nervous system notes, talking last week or last time about the central nervous system, which we said consisted of the brain and spinal cord. Now we're going to continue to talk about other divisions of the nervous system, and that is the peripheral nervous system. So this consists of the cranial nerves, which come off the brain, and the spinal nerves, which come off the spinal cord. So together these nerves form what we call the peripheral nervous system. So these are basically highways for information coming to and from the brain and spinal cord. So looking at this breakdown kind of flow chart, we already talked about the central nervous system, meaning the brain and spinal cord, and remember that the blue arrows represent sensory information, and so that's information coming into the central nervous system from the outside, and the red arrows represent motor or efferent information, which is carrying the response from the central nervous system to the body to respond to our environment and maintain homeostasis or protect us from danger. So the peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves, and those all of our spinal nerves are mixed nerves, which means they contain axons carrying sensory information as well as information leaving the brain and spinal cord, which would be motor or efferent information. So mixed nerves contain incoming and outgoing information via these two pathways. If we look at the motor response, which is again the response coming from the central nervous system to some effector organ, that could be a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, gland, or skeletal muscle, this would be the efferent pathway. That response is divided into somatic or autonomic. Somatic is voluntary skeletal muscle. That's the effector organ. The autonomic division of this motor response is the involuntary response, which is cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. We can further break down the autonomic response into, again, it's involuntary. Is it a rest and digest response, which would be a parasympathetic division of that autonomic response, or is it a fight or flight stress type of situation, which would be a sympathetic response? And in most cases, when we're maintaining homeostasis, we have a little bit of both acting together. We'll talk about that when we get more into the autonomic nervous system. But do really understand this flow chart. There's a lot of information here that if you understand what the red and the blue arrows represent, and you understand how each division is broken into smaller divisions, it'll really make sense when you put it all together. So be sure that you know this flow chart well. So when we look at the sensory pathway, we're looking at information coming in through the nerves to the central nervous system, the sensory division. There's different types of sensory receptors we see, and we can classify them into 5 general categories based on the type of stimulus that creates an action potential in these sensory receptors. So we're looking at the dendrite end of the neuron that are specialized into these special types of receptors. So mechanoreceptors respond to some type of physical force such as touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch. And when we talk about pressure, it could be physical pressure, like pressing on the skin, or it could be pressure within, for example, our blood vessels, which we have different levels of blood pressure that are always being detected, and our body will respond to that based on the information being given to the control mechanism or the control center for that specific mechanoreceptor. Then there are thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. We know that we have thermoreceptors in the skin that help to regulate body temperature. Photoreceptors respond to light, so we would expect to see those in the retina, that nervous layer on the inside of the eye. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals in the blood, or it might be chemicals in the interstitial fluid, or chemicals that are dissolved in our saliva to give us our sense of taste, or dissolved in the mucous membrane in our nasal cavity to give us a sense of smell. Those are examples of chemoreceptors. Along the same lines of chemoreceptors are osmoreceptors. That's another name that we can use that are in the hypothalamus, for example, that tell us the concentration of solutes in our blood. and if there's anything that needs to be adjusted. For example, hormone levels, solute levels in terms of concentration, to see if we need to, bring more water into the blood or move more water out of the blood through the kidneys. Those are all examples of chemoreceptors. Anytime we're looking at chemical concentrations in a fluid, those are detected by chemoreceptors. And again, we see those in the hypothalamus, we see them in the nasal cavity, and also in the oral cavity for smell and taste. And there's other examples as well, but those are the more common ones and ones that I would like you to remember. Nociceptors, these are specialized receptors of the four. They're kind of a subtype of these four major receptors. And these are stimulated when we have too much of a specific stimulus. For example, too much heat, too much cold, too much pressure, some inflammatory signals that are released when we damage, say you sprain an ankle. That releases inflammatory chemicals into that area, which help with healing, but initially can cause a lot of pain. So these are the receptors we're trying to shut down when we give pain medications. We'll talk more about that if you take advanced A&P, how that works. So we can also classify sensory receptors by their location within the body. So if you look at the prefixes here, X, that means outside, in means inside. So exteroceptors are receptors that are stimulated by conditions outside the body. So when you touch somebody, apply pressure, there's some painful stimuli coming to the outside, temperature changes, light, sound, taste, smell, those are all external stimuli, so we call the receptors that respond to that external stimuli exteroceptors. Interoceptors are receptors that respond to things inside the body, for example, looking at blood pressure or chemical changes within the blood, stretch of the bladder, stretch of the stomach, hunger, thirst. Those are all examples of receptors that respond to conditions inside the body. And then lastly, proprioceptors. This prefix, proprioception, think of it as body position or position. So proprioception is our awareness of body movement. So we find proprioceptors in our connective tissues, joints, muscles, ligaments, tendons. We find these specialized receptors that tell us about body position. Here's an example of a muscle spindle. It's a special organ within our muscles that have an interaction with neurons determining the stretch of a muscle, and the same thing with the Golgi tendon, determining stretch of the tendon. So these neurons have specialized ends, which are called proprioceptors, that communicate the amount of stretch in our muscles and tendons and send that information to the spinal cord for processing. So looking at the peripheral nervous system, it's made up of nerves, and in lab we talked about how nerves are different from neurons. Nerves are only a portion of the neuron, and that's the axon. So a nerve is a bundle of axons outside the central nervous system. Many of our nerves are myelinated. We can see this yellow covering is the myelin. The yellow covering is the connective tissue around the outside of the outside of the axon, and then we can see the myelin sheath, which is the fatty connective or the fatty covering over the axon that serves as insulation and really helps speed transmission. So the myelin sheath we talked about already helps speed transmission of impulses down the axon. So it's a bundle of axons. We can see we need a good blood supply coming to and within our nerves. So we can see that if you would compress a nerve, you would do damage to it, because these are parts of the neuron. They need oxygen and nutrients just like any other part of the cell, so it needs a good blood supply. So different types of nerves. Again, we have the cranial nerves. There's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Some have very specific functions, and you'll learn that in advanced A&P. So I don't expect you to know the names of the cranial nerves or their function. Just know that there are nerves that come off of the brain, and they're called cranial nerves. And then one of the cranial nerves we studied in lab was the optic nerve. Another one was the oculomotor nerve. But again, I'm not going to hold you accountable for that in lecture. And then along the spinal cord, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. and they come off and interlace with one another, forming a plexus. We talked about that in lab as well, but just know that there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are mixed nerves, which means they carry both sensory and motor information. But again, they separate and divide into their sensory path and motor path when they get near the spinal cord, when they divide into those dorsal and ventral roots. And again, we talked about that in the central nervous system lecture. So we have reflexes, which means there are instances where we need to provide protection to the body and elicit a response without the involvement of the brain. So a reflex arc, it's important that you know every structure in the pathway of a reflex arc. This will definitely be on the test, and I'm sure it's referenced on the final exam as well. So we have a receptor out here, some type of receptor. In this case, because we see a pin touching the skin, this is a mechanoreceptor, so this is going to be a specialized dendrite here to respond to stretch of this pin, and it might cause a little bit of nociceptor stimulation as that tissue is damaged and releases chemicals into that damaged area. So we have action potentials reaching threshold and traveling along the axon to the spinal cord. So this portion is the sensory neuron, bringing that information to the spinal cord, to the dorsal horn. And instead of going to the white matter and up the spinal cord, it goes right over to the motor side of this spinal cord, this gray matter, to the ventral horn, and a motor neuron exists beginning in the ventral horn. This would be the dendrites of the motor neuron, and that's going to carry that action potential to the effector organ. And the effector organ is the organ that's going to respond to the stimulus. So if we poke our skin with a pin, the effector organ is going to be the bicep muscle, and that's going to pull the arm. That muscle is going to contract and pull that arm or hand away from that stimulus. So receptor would be out here in the skin. Sensory neuron would be this blue neuron here. The integration center is the interneuron. It's what elicits or causes a response, and this would be the motor neuron carrying that response, and then the effector organ is what is actually responding to that stimulus. So there's a little animation here we can watch quickly that shows this process in action. So here's the sensory receptor, sensory neuron, afferent neuron's another name, interneuron, motor neuron, and you can see how that skeletal muscle responds. So when you're watching this, what is represented by the little red arrow is an action potential, reaching threshold along each path along the way and being transmitted out to that skeletal muscle. So this is a very rapid response that helps provide protection within the body. We have reflexes, several different reflexes in the body. We'll talk about a couple more here in just a minute. But we also have reflexes to our organs as well that, again, don't require involvement of the brain. So withdrawal reflex is a reflex we talked about. If you stepped on a pin, we would see the same thing. We would have the stimulus bringing sensory information to the spinal cord. An interneuron, which would connect that sensory pathway to the motor pathway, which would cause the hamstrings to contract, and that would pull your leg away from that painful stimulus. Now we do see information going to the brain, because if you step on something, you're definitely aware of it. You can feel the pain of that sharp pin, but again, this response does not require our voluntary movement of the leg. It happens reflexively. So we call this the withdrawal reflex, whether it's in the leg or if it was in the arm touching something that was hot on the tip of the finger, the same thing occurs. It's the withdrawal reflex. Now, if we look at that in a little more detail, not only do we contract the hamstring, but at the same time we also have involvement of the other muscle of the leg, which would be the rectus femoris, that would be relaxed to allow us to contract the hamstring. Because if you're walking, you might be contracting that rectus femoris, but in order to quickly pull the leg away, we have to quickly, at the same time as we contract the hamstring or the two tendinosis, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris muscle, in order to get those to contract, we need to relax these as well. So at the same time as we're stimulating these muscles, we're also inhibiting these neurons. So it's quite complex, this withdrawal reflex. So we call it reciprocal innervation, which means if we're going to stimulate one muscle, we have to relax the muscle on the other side of that limb to actually allow us to withdraw that limb. So at the same time, it becomes even more complex. We have to go to the other side of the spinal cord, which controls the other side of the body, to catch us with the other leg. Because if you're going to withdraw the leg that's stepping on the pin, we need to drop the leg that's going to support the body when this leg is drawn upward. So we call this the crossed extensor reflex, because we need to extend the good leg to catch ourselves and prevent us from tripping. So the benefit of the crossed extensor reflex is to prevent us from tripping when that withdrawal reflex is activated, when we draw up the leg that's being injured by the pin.